welcome. Welcome not only to Boston University, but also to an event led by the Initiative on Cities at BU. And the title of our event is Gentrification, Ideas to Action. So who am I? Who's this weird English person up here? My name is Loretta Lees. I'm Director of the Initiative on Cities at Boston University. I've been here for 4 years, and I've spent most of my career researching gentrification and doing scholar activist work fighting displacement. So for me personally, and for the BU Initiative on Cities, this is going to be a real kind of stellar afternoon. So we're very thrilled to be joined not just by academics, but also by practitioners, policymakers, housing activists, community organisers, people from different social movements, not just in Boston, but actually we have some people from around the US and actually some people who I'm going to introduce later internationally who are very well known in this kind of field. And I'm kind of, really interested in not only what we've got to say, because of course we're here, but also what you're going to do in terms of reacting to it and giving us new ideas that will take this initiative forward. So the way we're going to operate is we're going to start with a discussion of Japonica Brown-Saracino's new book, which, as you can see up here, well, talk about that in a minute, The Death and Life of Gentrification. So think about that title, A New Map of a Persistent Idea. So very much looking at what does gentrification as an idea, as a concept mean today? How has it changed over time? So I'm very excited to hear more about that. The second half of the event is going to be a launch of a new pilot initiative here with the BU Initiative on Cities, and that is our Gentrification and Urban Displacement Lab, which the abbreviation is GUDL. We're also going to share a couple of highlights of the kind of work that we're doing in the Initiative on Cities around gentrification and displacement. And just to give you a kind of sense of what we do more broadly. So for people who are not familiar with the Initiative on Cities, we are a university-wide research centre that focuses on all things urban, everything to do with cities. So we seek out disciplines across the institution who are doing work on anything from economics to the environment to humanities work on cities. And we try and get those people to come together to do convergence and to have conversations. Since our founding in 2014, we've been committed to serving as a bridge, not just between different academics at BU, but actually between the university and local community, particularly local communities in Boston, also Massachusetts, but increasingly we're looking at communities in other US cities and actually internationally abroad. Our work supports faculty across BU in terms of research, in terms of learning, but also in terms of practice in relation to the urban, or what we conceptualize as the urban, in relation to what's going on in cities, not just today, but actually humanities work in the past, which informs the future and the present as well. So some of the work that we do, I don't know if David Gross is here. We run an experiential learning program called MetroBridge, which leverages our fantastic BU students, and I will say the students here are amazing, to serve as researchers with and for cities and non-profits who are grappling with urban issues and need that kind of extra set of hands to do some of the data collection, do some of the conceptual work that will support them. That has really grown significantly, and we're very excited by that. We're also passionate about supporting different faculty in policymaking and practice and engaging their research with policymakers, with practitioners, and thinking what that engagement might look like. Of course, many academics think that their work is wonderful and it's automatically going to be of value to communities. But we do that dating bit in the middle, which is much more complex. And I think that's a really kind of important thing to do. So we do training, we provide training on this, skill building opportunities. We put their research in conversation with national, local, and indeed international policymakers and practitioners. So before we kind of jump in, I want to just briefly introduce Japonica first and then our three panelists. So it's an absolute pleasure to introduce Japonica, who's my colleague from sociology. So Japonica Brown-Saracino is a professor of sociology and a faculty fellow or BU urbanist in the Initiative in Cities. She is an ethnographer whose work spans urban and community sociology, cultural sociology, and the study of gender and sexualities. Indeed, she's widely known for her research and scholarship on gentrification and also on social preservation, including her award-winning book, A Neighborhood That Never Changes, and the edited volume, The Gentrification Debates Reader. Her newest book, which she's going to share with us today, The Death and Life of Gentrification, which we'll turn to in a minute, examines how the meaning of gentrification has changed and how it's being deployed as a metaphor to describe all sorts of other change that it didn't used to be used for. And I think it's really, really important. So our three panelists, thank you so much for coming. Absolutely wonderful to have you here. So first of all, we have Stephanie Ternullo, who's an assistant professor of government at Harvard University, whose research examines how social and local contexts shape political behaviour in the United States. Her first book, How the Heartland Went Red, Why Local Forces Matter in an Age of Nationalised Politics, showed how place influences partisan attachments through a comparative study of 3 white post-industrial cities since the 2020 presidential election. Her broader research explores how local contexts shape political participation. So she's looked at gentrification, she's looked at redistricting, can never pronounce that word, and governance, with current work focused on politics in democratic suburbs in Massachusetts and California. Karilyn Crockett, the end of the table, say hi, Karilyn, is an assistant professor of urban history, public policy and planning at MIT, whose research examines large-scale land use change in 20th century American cities with a focus on structural poverty, race and memory. Her award-winning book, People Before Highways, Boston Activists, Urban Planners, and a New Movement for City Making, explored the grassroots movement that halted highway expansion in Boston. And it was named one of Boston Public Library's 10 best books about Boston of the decade. She previously co-founded My Town, which is a nationally recognized youth education and tourism organization, and has held senior leadership roles in Boston city government, including serving as the city's first chief of equity. And last, but definitely not least, Lawrence Vale is the Ford Professor of Urban Design and Planning and Associate Dean at MIT's School of Architecture and Planning, where he directs the Resilient Cities Housing Initiative. A leading scholar of urban design, housing, and planning history, he is the author or editor of numerous books, more than 60 journal articles, and extensive and really important work on public housing, urban resilience, and the politics of the built environment. His most recent book, The Equitably Resilient City, Solidarities and Struggles in the Face of the Climate Crisis, won the 2025 Urban Affairs Association Best Book in Urban Affairs Award. And Lawrence has received numerous honours for his research, his teaching and advising, including the Lawrence Gherkins Prize for Sustained Excellence in Planning History. I cannot think of a better panel to be sat in front of us. And now I'm going to transition to Japonica.
Well, thank you, Loretta, for the introduction, and thank you to Stacy and the rest of the IOC for organizing this event. And I thank these 3 amazing panelists for being here. I really just appreciate it so much. So I thought that today, instead of just briefly summarizing my new book, I'd tell you a little bit about how I came to write it. I've been studying and writing about gentrification for more than 25 years. Most of my work has either involved ethnographic studies of gentrification on the ground in changing places or analyses of the scholarly literature on gentrification. I mention this both to convey that I never imagined writing The Death and Life of Gentrification and to explain how I ended up writing it anyway. As a favor to an editor when I was a brand new assistant professor, I agreed to edit a reader on gentrification. As I thought about how to organize the book, it struck me that the literature was better characterized by debate than agreement. I ended up titling the book The Gentrification Debate, spotlighting debate about gentrification's causes, consequences, and how to conceptualize the actors involved in the process. Several years later, after having stepped away from gentrification to write a book on queer women's migration to small US cities, I was asked to write an annual review of sociology article on gentrification. It was to be the first such paper in the journal in 30 years. So I very grudgingly waded back into the giant gentrification literature. When I did, I was struck by how much discord continued to permeate that literature. If anything, the chasm between how different scholars approach gentrification seemed to have grown over time. Even more significantly, the divide was oriented not just around the causes and consequences of the process. I noticed a tremendous gap in how scholars conceptualize and therefore measure gentrification. This gap is most strikingly apparent in the differences between how quantitative and qualitative studies conceptualize and measure gentrification. As a result, we are studying different places and perhaps even different processes. It is little wonder then that we can't agree on outcomes such as the centrality of displacement, because we are more and more looking at different places and even at different points in time. Now, some of this disagreement emerges from a really good place. Scholars, including myself, now consider gentrification in rural contexts as well as all over the globe. Loretta turned our attention to super gentrification, or the gentrification of already gentrified neighborhoods by the financial elite. There isn't just one gentrification anymore. There are gentrifications. This led me to wonder, what does gentrification even mean anymore? Does the term first coined by Ruth Glass in 1964 have any shared coherence, even among those who aim to study the process she first described? Still, it didn't occur to me that I would embark on a new book on gentrification until I conducted an ethnography of Dyke Bar commemoration. Again, I thought I was getting away from gentrification studies and was doing research on sexualities and place. But gentrification has a way of showing up where we least expect it to. I found that lesbian bar commemorators rely on talk of gentrification to bring disparate LGBTQ plus individuals together to forge community. They neither aim to revive bars nor to forestall literal gentrification by advocating for affordable housing and commercial leases. Instead, they used talk of gentrification to conjure a sense of shared marginality among LGBTQ plus individuals. Disdain for gentrification served as a social glue that aided connection across race, class, gender, and age. I watched a New Orleans troupe perform their Dyke Bar musical, which suggested that while the bar was once threatened by homophobia, today it's threatened by gentrification. I stood shoulder to shoulder in the Stonewall Inn with a crowd that grew misty-eyed as an older woman described how gentrification destroyed what was once a vibrant lesbian bar scene in Lower Manhattan. Because these commemorators didn't go to great lengths to specify what gentrification is, evoking the term allowed them to bring a diverse group of people together and to provide them with the feeling that they are on the same side of some opaque battle. This research unexpectedly drew my attention to how gentrification operates as a discursive tool. When bar commemorators place gentrification front and center, despite the fact that they do not aim to advocate against gentrification, I started to wonder, what work does talk of gentrification accomplish for certain individuals and groups? I also started to wonder, what is the relationship between the work gentrification accomplishes and the definitional chaos apparent in the gentrification literature, which seemed to be mirrored by the ambiguous way in which bar commemorators use the term gentrification. Around this time, I started noticing talk of gentrification everywhere. I stumbled upon articles about the gentrification of collard greens, rest areas, and penile implants. Delivery guys talk about the gentrification of beer. Academics write about the gentrification of child support enforcement services. Journalists quip about the gentrification of the gay politician. People fret that pubs have gentrified. I noticed gentrification in novels, TV series, and films. Some of these fictional depictions include portraits of brick and mortar gentrification. But as with Dyke Bar commemorators, it was clear to me that they were using gentrification to have conversations that weren't really about neighborhood change. All kinds of people toss gentrification around for different purposes, and they assign a range of meanings to it. To be clear, when they talk about gentrification, they aren't always talking about the process Ruth Glass originally defined as the movement of the middle classes into working class neighborhoods. According to Glass, the middle class renovated existing housing, raising prices, and displaced original working class residents. My new book grapples with the increasingly heterogeneous meanings assigned to gentrification and the diverse ways in which we leverage the word to accomplish a diverse set of aims. It explores the new territories that gentrification has taken, migrating from its home in urban studies to art, television, literature, film, social media, and activism. Gentrification is a lens through which some present the world and through which we interpret things, from sandwiches to sculpture to our own selves. Slowly, I became more and more certain that Dyke Bar commemorators weren't the only ones using gentrification to tell stories, call people together, and signal their position on broad social issues. I also began to recognize that they weren't alone in underspecifying what they meant by gentrification, and I wondered how this related to the definitional chaos that I'd noticed in the gentrification scholarship. As I took this all in, the discord in the gentrification literature, the way bar commemorators leverage talk of gentrification to rekindle community, and how all kinds of people rely on gentrification as a metaphor, the question central to my book solidified. What does gentrification mean within and beyond the academy? How does that meaning vary? What work does talk of gentrification accomplish for cultural producers such as novelists, screenwriters, sculptors, and journalists? How do works and concepts circulate through the world, and how does their meaning change as they do so? So somewhat grudgingly, I embarked on researching the death and life of gentrification. Ultimately, I concluded that one way of thinking of gentrification as referring to a very specific material urban process along the lines of what Glass first described has perished, and in its place, the word has taken on a life of its own. It has made a place for itself in our novels, on our screens, and in our heads. More and more of us are familiar with what the Showtime series The Curse calls the G word. But increasingly, they use the word not just to discuss urban transformation, but specifically to gesture to generalized upscaling, the appropriation by elites of something that once belonged to the working class, particularly to working class ethnic and racial minorities, the loss of authenticity and community, and involuntary change. Now, why do so many people turn to gentrification for these purposes? I argue that gentrification has come to occupy space rendered vacant by the absence of a shared language for directly addressing structural inequalities and concomitant social change. In the absence of this language, some use talk of gentrification to diagnose the structural roots of inequalities. Others rely on gentrification to cultivate ties, to mark the transformation of place-based communities, and to describe the evolution of the self. In other words, gentrification fills gaps created by hesitancy to cultivate language that directly acknowledges inequalities and other related social problems. We aren't just talking about gentrification when we talk about gentrification anymore. Now, I'm not going to go into the finer details of my evidence and argument, but I do want to be clear that in the book, I turn the lens on academics like me. Scholars, too, rely on gentrification to diagnose problems of political economic systems, even when the problems they seek to diagnose aren't specific to literal gentrification. Some, like the communications scholar Jessa Lengel, use gentrification as a metaphor, writing of the gentrification of the internet. Likewise, musicologists published a volume on musical gentrification. Some write about literal gentrification, but at heart, they use gentrification as a metaphorical heuristic to point to the systemic roots of problems much broader than urban upscaling, from the imbrication of planning and development to rescue capitalism. I don't have time to go into detail about this, but I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that scholars join filmmakers and TV script writers and so many others in relying on gentrification as a vehicle for offering a much broader critique. Why do we use gentrification to tell these stories about how individuals and communities change? Why do cultural producers rely on it to bring disparate people together, to engender support for movements, and to forward arguments about the structural roots of social problems? Part of the answer is that gentrification is highly recognizable and retrievable. Both literal gentrification and gentrification as a word are abundant and enduring. This ubiquity and familiarity render the term highly accessible. Second, gentrification is deeply associated with the urban, which is in its own right weighty and charged. Gentrification is especially evocative of urban, racial, and economic inequalities and sexual heterogeneity. It's become a shorthand that allows us to, in some cases, efficiently reference these subjects and in others dodge direct conversation about them. Gentrification can be a wink. We say that San Francisco's mission has gentrified rather than acknowledging the displacement of Latinx populations and an influx of white tech workers. In other words, gentrification evokes racial, economic, and sexual difference and related inequalities that we associate with the urban. The term gestures to these issues without having to talk about them directly. Third, gentrification evokes not only the urban, but change itself. Because change is such a general and inclusive experience, this association renders gentrification nimble and resonant. It is this conflagration with change that partially allows gentrification to evoke personal and collective transformations, from evolving class status to changing sexual identities. Fourth, gentrification is easily adopted for a variety of purposes because it's multivocal. This is in part because it's a concept that is hotly contested by experts. The fractured scholarly literature, which seeps into the media, helps liberate gentrification from any narrow meaning. Gentrification can tell a range of stories and accomplish an array of aims. This is not the only reason gentrification operates as a metaphor, but it is one piece of the explanation for why we find gentrification on our screens and novels, songs, and on Reddit. But that's not all. Part of why so many rely on gentrification is because they yearn for language that captures their sense of deepening inequalities and of how the decks are stacked against those with fewer resources. Broadly speaking, in my archive, gentrification serves to communicate concerns with inequalities, exploitation, appropriation, and in the most general terms of all, with economic and political systems that benefit some at the cost of many. Gentrification carries worries about social inequalities with it, particularly those we tend to code as urban, such as racial inequalities. In this sense, gentrification's ubiquity is a signal of how cultural producers and everyday actors grapple for language that expresses that a broad reappropriation is afoot. Gentrification is a way of talking about inequalities and the systems that produce them without having to call them by name. So in this context, what does gentrification mean now anyway? Well, I find that the term is used in a multitude of ways. Across these diverse usages, there's one foundational shared assumption. Nearly every deployment of gentrification in my archive rests on the premise that gentrification is a problem, or at the very least that it produces or exacerbates social problems, including exploitation, the breakdown of community, and commercialization. To gentrify as a person, for instance, is not to acquire resources that we are supposed to celebrate. Talk of gentrification only brings Dyke Bar commemorators and audiences together because of shared belief that literal gentrification is problematic. Gentrification works as a heuristic that evokes the problems of contemporary capitalism and neoliberalism because the operating premise is that gentrification is itself a problem. This underlines the import and timeliness of the kind of work that the Gentrification and Urban Displacement Lab will undertake. At least in the contemporary American context, there is broader and broader worry about the problems gentrification signals. First and foremost, problems related to displacement, but also to the loss of distinction and perceived authenticity and the fracturing of longstanding communities. I think we live in a moment when more and more people are poised to resist both the literal and metaphorical gentrification, and we need more research and policy aimed at doing just that. My book suggests that the meaning of gentrification will continue to evolve. which is all the more reason why we ought to harness this moment when I think many are ready to engage and work to limit brick and mortar gentrification and displacement. Before I close, I just want to thank the Initiative on Cities for organizing this terrific event and also for their support of my work in so many ways, including with a small grant that I used to begin the gentrification literature review that sort of turned me in this direction in the first place. I also want to thank the BU Center for the Humanities for a fellowship that allowed me to begin drafting early chapters, and the Center for Innovation and Social Sciences and BU Spark for a mini grant that enabled me to work with a great team of students to scrape newspaper and Reddit data for the book. So, and of course, I have to thank the sociology department for all of their ongoing support. Anyway, I look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to listen now to some comments from our three panelists, and then after that, there's going to be a little bit of a Q&A between Japonica and the panelists, and then we're going to open it up to the audience for your input. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I have to say it's a real honor to be here. As an urban and community sociologist, as a cultural sociologist, Japonica is, I would say, so central to our field and our discipline, and to have the opportunity to be in conversation with her, it's a real treat. And it's especially a treat because as someone who I think has read everything Japonica's written multiple times, it's exciting to see sort of the direction she's going in this book. So as we know from what she said in the book, she's studying gentrification as an idea, right? Not just as a concrete social process or an urban process. And she's not just studying it as an idea that's contested by scholars. She's done both of those things, right? She's now studying it as a concept, a metaphor, something that is used by cultural producers. And this is important for a lot of reasons. But as she tells us in the book, it's important because studying these cultural objects, the way that gentrification is used in these cultural objects, tells us something about how folks are making meaning of important social changes and systemic inequalities, but it also tells us something about action, because we know that culture can shape action. It gives us the tools for making sense of these changes and circumscribes the kinds of solutions we might think are appropriate, right? And as she sort of gestures that in the conclusion of the book, it can also shape inaction, where it kind of creates silences. And I think what I want to focus my comments on today is really about the timeliness of this contribution. So as Japonica tells us, gentrification has become this kind of ubiquitous metaphor and metonym, in part because brick and mortar gentrification, the actual process of urban upscaling, or at least one key piece of that process, displacement, is also becoming ubiquitous, right? It's not just affecting working class communities. It feels like it's affecting almost every neighborhood and every large urban center. It's something that resonates with working class, middle class, even, some upper middle class folks who feel like the financial elite are super gentrifying their communities. And as a result of this, it allows folks like Dyke Bar commemorators to use gentrification as a sort of mobilizing framework, because it doesn't have this narrower kind of us versus them groupness to it, right? Usually when we think about the way that social movement leaders try to cultivate group attachments, there's an in-group and then there's an out-group, and that requires a sort of shared history or shared sense of community, a way of building that identity. And what Japonica shows us is that gentrification is actually so ubiquitous, it's so resonant, that it can create even broader communities than some of the sort of narrower identities that might otherwise divide folks who are showing up to these Dyke Bar commemoration events. And she shows us that this sort of appeal to gentrification, this yearning for what is lost, is perhaps particularly resonant amongst queer communities and other marginalized groups who've had these opportunities for upward mobility, or maybe even assimilation in some of the contexts about which you're writing. But that it also has this resonance for a broader group of people, as she said today, who are kind of looking around them, anticipating neighborhood change and feeling fear about what they might lose, whether that's their home or a neighborhood bar they might love, or just this intangible sense of authenticity that Japonica's written about for years now. And then she also shows us that this fuzziness of gentrification as a concept and as a metaphor means that cultural producers can use it to try to elucidate these broader economic and social processes like neoliberalism or late-stage capitalism, or even to sometimes obscure those processes. So when people talk about gentrification of the self as a choice, they might be blaming folks for making that choice rather than recognizing that there's a structure that incentivizes or even requires people to constantly be sort of seeking upward mobility. And the combination of these two factors, so the context of gentrification feeling ubiquitous and the fuzziness of the concept, mean that, as she talks about in the conclusion, it might be a useful call to action, because cultural producers, like she told us today, might be using it to call attention to systemic inequalities that they otherwise might not. She writes that in a cultural context in which many struggle to speak directly about some of the problems of capitalism, gentrification is a much relied upon vehicle for indirectly doing just that. But I think this raises several important questions that are maybe left unanswered in the book and maybe are another volume. Because I do think the book, in taking this quasi-literary approach to the study of gentrification as a cultural object, it really focuses on the resonance, the multivocality of this term in the contemporary cultural context, and less so on the contemporary cultural context itself. It's there. It's, as I said, it's there in your argument. It's flowing through the sense that, you know, we're all fearing neighborhood change because of late stage capitalism. But there's something particular about this moment, I think, and I think you think, that means that inequality and precarity are omnipresent in everyone's life, making gentrification so resonant as a cultural frame. And yet also we're unable to talk about it. So what is that? And I think that understanding what it is about living in a moment, you know, this isn't the 1920s. We're not living in a moment of widespread sense of precarity and a particular call to action about that precarity. We're living in a moment with that sort of economic system also potentially collapsing around us, and yet unable to talk about it. I think as a political scientist, probably a lot of that has to do with the fact that we're actually living in sort of different partisan bubbles with different names for this precarity, different cultural producers in your language telling us what the problem is and what the right solution is. And so we're unable to kind of come together and talk about it. And in that particular context, gentrification can work as a sort of unifying framework. But I would love to hear the Japonica Brown-Saracino take on this cultural and political moment.
Now we're going to turn over to Karilyn.
Let's make sure my mic is on. Can you hear me? Hi, good afternoon. We're here. It is so great to be here and be in conversation. I've been looking forward to this panel and discussion for a while, so it's really wonderful to be here. And Japonica, thank you so much for this fantastic work, which has haunted me. I feel like that's fitting here. I think about the title of this work, The Death and Life of Gentrification, and I cannot help but think about the way that it is calling forth Jane Jacobs here to think about of course, the death and life of great American cities, the Jacobs classic of 1961. But what is missing is the idea of cities. And so I feel like you're hunting. The work has haunted me because you're asking us to think about gentrification not just as a description, as you note, of an economic process, but a kind of identity that's starting to form for people. There's this shared experience of change, of extraction, of hyper extraction that we can think about as spatial, that we can think about as social, as economic. And so that's the haunt for me. And so I appreciate the opportunity to travel with you through New York, New Orleans, San Francisco, places that I have been and now I'm rethinking. I'm thinking about the experience in Boston as well. What does it mean for people to experience loss or longing and trying to name that? But at the same time, I feel like gentrification, as you note, is speaking to kind of an upscaling, kind of like a move towards sort of a luxury desire for place, a luxury building of tastes. Kind of there's something that's happening at a population level across the country, maybe across the world, where this certainly in the U.S. context, this deep sense of acquisition. You're trying to have things. You're trying to move to the next thing, whether it's the gentrification of collard greens and kale, or gentrification of the internet, or gentrification of the sitcoms or some of the films that you shared. Really provocative, and again, for me, haunting, because I'm wondering in this conversation about what's being lost or what's being extracted, and the point that Stephanie's making around precarity, how much more has life become much more precarious for folks for whom are not benefiting from the wealth creation? That extraction element has been deadly, quite deadly for folks who are losing housing security, food security, access to jobs, which is something that's also defining this period. And so I felt myself, again, haunted in the work, because you are making a cultural argument, a social argument, a very ethnographic argument, which I appreciate so deeply. Yet the question for me is, well, who gets to survive, benefit? How is life made better through these kinds of processes when we know the evidence suggests in every way that that is not the case at all? And so when I think about some of my work, if for the city of Boston, we're constantly talking about gentrification in the context of housing. And so how is it that the idea of people losing the ability to have access to good housing, to affordable housing, how does that affect the way cities function the way they are? And so that's, again, why the title is haunting me and making me think about Jane Jacobs, because there's something about the city that is quite literally missing in the title, but then the idea of gentrification is taking us away from what it means to be in a city, what it means to be in a shared settlement, a social contract or compact that would allow us to be in community. And so I'm sitting here thinking very much about the reality of just the heaviness of cost, the cost burden of living in a city where more than 50% of the people in Boston are rent burdened. So people who are paying more than 30% of their income, that's real. That number is increasing. How much that number, that percentage has increased over the last 20 and 30 years. And that is how many of us are thinking about who gets to be in the city, how precarious life is when you cannot afford to literally live there. And I guess my last comment, and then I'll turn to Larry, is for me, the larger discussion that I'm happy that we can have in a town square is the way that we decouple housing affordability from incomes and jobs, and the ways that we know in real terms that wages peaked. I think maybe you'll know this better, in like 1973, right? I think the hourly wage is like $4.03. And that's the peak. And in today's dollars, it's $20 an hour. And so there has not been any wage growth. There's not been any growth in terms of jobs. And so when we have a conversation about housing, that's only one part of the equation. We have not had a similar conversation about how do we keep jobs and income increasing so that the conversation about housing affordability starts to look a bit different, because those things are quite decoupled. So this is within and beyond what you've offered here, but you're taking us so deeply inside of these issues, at least for me. And again, that sense of haunting and possibility of what it means to think about a different kind of research agenda that can get us out of this kind of slippage of just a word that is speaking to like a zeitgeist or a moment, but there's something very serious and very dangerous about the state of cities, many of them that you call out. So I appreciate the chance to just bring our imaginations and bring our sense of what is just and equitable into the discussion. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm really thrilled to join this panel, and I loved having an early access to this book, which I spent a lot of time turning pages and corners and jotting things. And so it's really a pleasure to do that. One of the things that Loretta prompted us about was to ask, well, how does gentrification fit with other terms that might matter and might also have do cultural work or do other things that are maybe even masking things and other things. And so I'm someone who's just been drawn for a long time to widely bandied terms that lack consensus or consistent meaning. And one of the things that I really like about the book is that it shows that the struggle over to understand the meaning is at least as important as whatever that meaning may be or the meanings that may emerge. And so clearly gentrification, with or without the quotation marks that it needs to convey the metaphorical site, has really helped us understand what's at stake. So as I look back in my work, I think it joins a bunch of other slippery terms that would include nationalism or national identity, affordable housing, certainly, another one that masks as much as it reveals. And then more recently for me, resilience. In those cases, though, one of the puzzles for me was, whether there is some kind of literal thing that people understand, and then whether that operates more metaphorically, that should be rendered in quotation mark. And at least with resilience, there doesn't seem to be a single starting point. It depended a lot on people's professional training. If you ask a psychologist, they'll say it started with psychology. If you ask an engineer, they'll say it started with engineering. If you ask an ecologist, they'll say, no, it was 1973 and we did it. And the urbanists and architects are in some ways latecomers to some of that. I had a chance to attend a symposium about a dozen years ago now in Switzerland, where they assembled all of these different people. I was glad there was a psychiatrist there who would wonder why seemingly intelligent people were all gathering to talk about this word. But it was. It prompted me to write a piece called "The Politics of Resilient Cities: Whose Resilience and Whose City," and it was also, I think, maybe a pithier and less academic title in the Cities Reader called "Resilient Cities: Clarifying Concept or Catch-all Cliche." And so the issue for me there was that it proliferated into public use because it got filtered through a lot of different professional lenses and then got applied by non-professionals. But it's still in people coping with changed circumstances that are quite literal. In this case, like wars and floods and heat crises and things like that. Rather than seemingly spread by metaphors and metonyms and parables and heuristics. But then I started thinking, wait a minute, somebody writes a book called The Resilient Enterprise about businesses, and they're really trying to use the engineering metaphor or somebody else's thing. So I think it's another good term to think with in a lot of these different things, even though with resilience, there wasn't a death of some original set of contested literal meanings and that moved on to cultural products, at least not yet, but now I can think it's going to happen. But it does make me wonder, again, about the title, as Karilyn was saying. And I kind of wonder whether we are talking about death in life, or if we were with resilience, it would probably be the 9 lives of resilience. And, not to be too catty, I'm not 100% convinced that the 9 lives of gentrification isn't also a more accurate metaphor than death in life. So I really recommend this great contribution that lays out various variants of gentrification as metaphor, and the way that they have all entered our interpretive cultural lexicon. The challenge for me is that this variety, so as Japonica puts it, this new vast life as a weighty metaphor, risks being interpreted sequentially succeeding the still more commonly voiced things that we understand as literal gentrification, the things that Karilyn has just been talking about in cities. Even if that term has been so contested and so many contrasting camps in a complex historiography that Japonica and Loretta are leaders in explaining to us. So I can agree that gentrification has reemerged and widened yet again beyond descriptions of neighborhood upscaling. But the earlier ideas haven't really died out either. It seems like they've hybridized and they've multiplied, maybe more like rabbits than cats. But so we have lots of contentious cousins and new tattooed partners attending the family reunion with their kale salad in the Starbucks that replaced the former Green in Chicago. That's a real thing. So I don't see metaphorical gentrification with quotation marks as pushing out or displacing the older notions that continue to thrive and evolve. They've just begot new generations too. So ultimately, I see this book as making really important progress. It's coupling analytical openness with efforts to categorize. You're giving order to a chaotic concept and helping us to clarify rather than let it be a catch-all cliche. And the thing that really struck me repeatedly as going through it was that just how many anticipatory pushbacks have already been considered, confronted, and deftly parried in these pages. Many places feel like they've been revised and given all sorts of further nuance in response to commentary from others. So in other words, the book itself already reads like a thoughtful panel about the book. And so I feel a little redundant.
Thank you, Larry, so much. So Japonica, do you want to couple of responses first?
Sure.
And then I can direct some questions.
Sure. I mean, these were great comments. I think I'll start with Karilyn, and I think we should feel haunted. And I think part of what my sense in diving into this archive is that many people feel very haunted, but they don't really have words to describe why they feel haunted, especially because many of the people who are privileged enough to be creating television shows or films or writing novels that I'm writing about aren't sure that their social position warrants the feelings of being haunted that they're feeling. And some of that sense of haunting is about their own precarity, but a lot of it is looking out and seeing how many other people are precarious and then not knowing what to do with their privilege, because their privilege isn't so great that there's enormous things that they feel that they can do with that. So it's that stuckness that I think leads us to this sort of metaphorical use of the term. And I think maybe that relates to something, hopefully I'm going to remember my own train of thought that Stephanie, you asked such a great question at the end about sort of why people, let me go to my notes, why can't we talk about things directly? And is it the partisan bubbles? And I think that's probably part of the answer, and you know better than I do. I'm definitely not a political scientist. But my sense is that part of the answer is that people increasingly feel like they have to make a really broad, bold critique of big systems like capitalism and neoliberalism, that there isn't sort of a small claim to make anymore, and they're not ready to make that big claim. And I'm not well prepared to say why they're not ready to go all the way there. But gentrification seems to be about as close as they're careful going toward that right now. And so, maybe, and there's a lot happening politically right now, that could be changing right now, or it might not. It could move in the opposite direction. But I see gentrification as really like a halfway, like people going halfway towards making direct arguments about big systemic issues. And again, to ask them to change, potentially, these neoliberal subjects who find themselves to be precarious, like, what are they going to do when they say capitalism shouldn't exist anymore? I don't think they have plans for themselves. So it's easier to make quips about gentrification and signal discontent than to offer some, very specific alternative, which is a little depressing. I find it quite depressing, actually, but at the same time hopeful, because there is a critique, right? So we're stuck in this moment of critique, but also a lot of fear, I think. And Larry, thank you for your comments. And I think the 9 lives is probably right. Loretta and I co-organized a conference with the help of the IOC on gentrification and displacement in 2023. And that was when I was like, oh my goodness, gentrification is dead. Because we invited several keynote speakers who said, I don't like to use the word gentrification. So these are like the people we picked as like the big people on gentrification in the world. And they were like, gentrification doesn't work for me anymore. So I think there's an argument to be made in my head. I said back to the panel as I was writing the book, like that conference suggests in one sense, gentrification is dead, at least as a term that we like feel completely unself-conscious using as scholars without thinking about some of its fraughtness. But you're right, it's proliferated, and there's a new book on touristification coming out. I mean, there are lots and lots of gentrifications that we write about. So it is still alive in many other ways.
I came across a new one in New Orleans last week, elevation gentrification. So that's my most recent one. Any other comments back to Japonica to get a conversation going on that?
I know this is being recorded, right? But we're among friends here. So, Japonica, I was wondering, was there something you wanted to say a little bit, but didn't get to say in a couple of these? There are a couple places here, maybe that's a coffee for later, but I felt like in a couple of the early chapters, it was just right under the surface, maybe something else that you'd want to say in part 2 of this book or something, or like that's kind of still bubbling for you that didn't quite make it to the page, but it's just right under in some way.
I mean, perhaps there's some tension in the book between my desire to be generous with the creators of some of the cultural objects that I'm writing about. Because I think everything I write about is like a beautiful work of art. I mean, the works of art that I deeply appreciate. Yeah. But then if I'm reading them through the lens of how is gentrification operating, what work is it doing, some of them are very problematic. So in almost every chapter, I'm trying to balance those things. Yeah. So I think that is a tension, and whether I thread that exactly right, I don't know. But that's my own internal debate. Like, how do I say these things are beautiful things, and I'm glad we get to enjoy them in the world, but also the way gentrification is operating in them may be problematic, especially the works on the gentrification of the self that I write about, that are about the upward mobility of sexual minorities and racial minorities, mostly women, and these stories we tell that sort of problematize upward mobility as a kind of gentrification that leads to the loss of authenticity and community, and the story you can't come home anymore. And the idea that we are going to hold individuals responsible for seeking opportunity when there are all these structural reasons why they needed to go away from home to realize new opportunities, I think is problematic. But I love watching Vito. Like, it's a great series. I highly recommend it. So anyway, I wanted to hold both those things in the chapters.
Very well. That's why it makes me as a reader lean in a little bit. So, okay. Thank you. I'm basically saying thank you.
Shall I butt in with a question? So one thing that really interests me, and it kind of feeds into the Gentrification Urban Displacement Lab, is does this metaphorical notion of gentrification create issues for the literal gentrification that people are fighting against, which I think we'd all agree it does. If so, how? And more importantly, what can we do about that? And this is for everybody here. But Japonica first.
Well, I mean, I think the water is very muddy, let me say it that way. Apologies if anyone was at the bookstore event that I did last week, but I told this story of the night before the bookstore event. I didn't want to think about the bookstore event, so I discovered Law and Order, the British version, which I didn't know was a thing. And I turned on an episode, and of course it was all about gentrification. And it really does haunt me. It follows me everywhere I go. And sort of the very briefly, the story was that a sort of evil developer, a truly evil developer, had tried to displace people from a building that they'd purchased, and they tampered with heat, and it led to the death of a baby. And it wraps up very neatly. This person this is discovered, they go to jail, they're punished. right? And in what world is that actually how we explain gentrification? That there's this one evil person and we can see that person and they can go to jail, right? If only it were that simple. And so when we're absorbing these cultural images, or the students we're teaching are absorbing these images, I think it ends up helping us to make gentrification overly neat and look away from systems. On the flip side, I've encountered ways that people are using gentrification that are so broad that basically gentrification stands in for displacement writ large. I took my students on a wonderful tour of a Boston neighborhood for my Boston Neighborhoods course last semester. And we had a tour guide who was describing the displacement of Black populations in the Boston area over a century as gentrification, including displacement related to changing industrial uses of space. So a broader definition than I would usually use. And of course, that would call out a different policy response if that's how we're going to think about gentrification, not right or wrong, but how we respond to it depends on how we use it. And I don't think any of us is living in some bubble where we're not absorbing these messages. And so we're all wrestling with these like competing ideas of what it is, who's to blame, what are the outcomes.
So I think also as scholars for, I know your question was about for policymakers and activists and responding to gentrification as a real process of urban change. But as scholars, I think that it makes it difficult to be in conversation with each other when we're talking about neighborhood change and urban change in particular. And I actually really love that you wrote this book, because when I was in graduate school, I was in my ethnography practicum studying a neighborhood of Chicago, Bridgeport, and talking about what was going on there as gentrification. And my professor, Kristen Schultz, was like, read everything Japonica has written and come back to me and tell me what is actually happening in that neighborhood, and is it gentrification? What do you mean by gentrification? Who are the actors and what do they want in this community and how is it changing? And I think that when we have this kind of like fuzziness to gentrification, whether it's either overly neat or if it's overly broad, we aren't able to say we obfuscate what's going on the ground, and that makes it more difficult for us to actually describe how urban neighborhoods or rural towns are changing today, and then link them back to those broader processes, which then has policy policy implications. But it means that the literature kind of, as you talk about in the book, ends up in these, I think sometimes overly academic debates about conceptualization and measurement, when really we're talking about different things, and that if we could just describe them and not use the term, actually just take away the term. And I think this is why some of the folks you invited to this conference say they don't use the term anymore, because it creates either this broadening or narrowing that is not useful in actually describing ethnographically, as you do in your work, what is going on the ground in urban neighborhoods.
So, I mean, that kind of relates to related question about maybe using social cleansing, domicide. So lots of kind of activist groups I've been interviewing, talking to globally, they prefer those words and those terms to gentrification. If we were to adopt those terms instead of gentrification, what would that mean? And what would that do for us that gentrification is now potentially unable to do for us?
The thing that, yeah, wow. So we have the problem of people using terms to avoid saying what they really mean. That has been upended in some parts of our politics by people saying the quiet part out loud all the time now. And so the question to me is, if people of different political persuasions start doing more of that, won't it just increase the incapacity to speak to one another? And that's what I worry about. And I think that's one of the things we learn about gentrification and its metaphors, is that it mediates between extremes because people can read more into it. And it doesn't necessarily have to be the province of one political party anymore.
I also wonder what it means when we decide we as people, as community members together, what does it mean when we decide who gets to live in the city or who has a right to the city, to use that Lefebvre language, or kind of what is the, if we say that to your point of if is the language, is it domicile, is it kind of, what are we actually naming as a target that we're trying to counteract? So I appreciate, Loretta, the question and the framing, because it kind of makes us not necessarily be focused on this maybe abstract process of transformation, which gentrification connotes, but something more specific about place. But who has a right to be in this place and to be able to live here and to have access to the resources that you need for life and your family? And that is the enduring question. And because also I think Japonica is taking us back through so many different genres and through time as well, sort of really zeroing in, at least for me, on this 60, 65-year period or so, where there has been so much change and disruption and displacement in the US context. And so, I mean, I'm still obsessed with highways and how they come and how they're stopped. And so I've written this book about the anti-highway fight in Boston and the success that people have had here in stopping the expansion of I-95. And so in working on that book, I was really wondering what people were trying to do. And it seemed like they were successful. They stopped I-95. We have like a new Orange Line. We got a Southwest Corridor Park. We got extended Red Line. We have all these things that we know about. And people who know the story, we celebrate it. And when I talked to folks after, and I've shared this with some people who are in this room, we were talking about this earlier this week, this was great. This was a success story. And some of the most senior organizers in this said, it was not a success. I was like, what are you talking about? No, you stopped the highway. I wrote this whole book about that. It's wonderful. It's great. And they said no, because we wouldn't have no idea that 60 years later or so, that all of these neighborhoods that we thought we were protected from a highway would be so gentrified, whether it's Jamaica Plain or Roxbury, the South End, that to know that stopping this interstate highway allowed this rabid investment and upscaling and luxury landscape, luxury everything to happen. And I could not imagine that was a sense of regret or concern or, and so your question is probing and deep for me to ask us to, again, take responsibility as people who live in the city to say, well, whom is this city for and whom are we willing to kind of fight for and with for them to be able to stay here now 10 years, 20 years, and 30 years out. And to know that folks who were at the front line in many of those battles in the 1960s are looking back and saying, this is not what we were fighting for in Boston or New York with Jane Jacobs or in LA and other places. What will we be able to say in 50 or 60 years from now? Who were we able to lay claim for, to hold space for right now, because it will be consequential, even though it seems abstract. So thank you for the chance to kind of reframe, but I think that's definitely what's at stake in this moment, particularly when we think about the occupant of the White House and whoever else. Yeah.
How much time we've got, Stacey? 5 minutes. Okay. So we had a big international conference that Japonica and I co-organized, which was amazing, people from all over the world. So if we could take our mindset out of the United States, which is predominantly the kind of empirical focus of the book, and it's also, it works in the UK, so you're watching Law and Order in the British context. But, Japonica, you're doing book tours in Europe and other places. How do we think this is going to play out for other countries around the world that are experiencing processes of gentrification? Not just in, is it Vienna you're going to in the summer and places like that, but, in China, in India, in Latin America. Any sense of that? And also from the panelists as well.
I don't have a neat answer to that question. I will say that I participated in a great mini conference in Germany a couple years ago on gentrification stories, and it was mostly people in the humanities writing about how gentrification operates as like literary devices and sort of the parallel in film. So there definitely are people all over the world who are grappling with this, but that was a mostly European audience. I do think that part of what I'm writing about a cultural moment in the United States that has to do with how long gentrification has been building up here. And so I do think that there's like a historical specificity to the argument that may resonate more in the United States and certain other mostly European countries that have been living with gentrification for multiple decades now. There's a sense of fatigue, right? Like the Dyke Bar commemorators weren't really even hoping that by like, commemorating bars, they didn't really want Dyke bars to come back or think they would. They didn't think that they were ever going to move back to the neighborhoods they'd been gentrified out of, but they were worried about the next people being gentrified out of the next neighborhood, sort of was the feeling. And that comes with long exposure to gentrification. So I imagine that this will come all over the globe, but it may not be in exactly this form in some places where gentrification is at an earlier stage right now.
It feels like going just based on your own arguments here, it feels like the kind of prerequisites for gentrification as a metaphor in the way you're talking about here is not just the decades of experience of gentrification. It's there because that requires the ubiquity. It requires people to be able to call on this in this mobilizing way, but it's also sort of deep inequality, the kinds of things Karilyn was talking about, where there's this, wealth extraction that's accruing to just the tippity tip of the 1%. So a deep inequality, a politics in which people can't talk about what they really want to talk about, and a sense, I think, as Larry said, that other words and frameworks for mobilizing people might be more divisive. Like there's a couple of building blocks for this argument, I think, that are lurking under here that would apply in a lot of contexts: the inequality, the polarization, and the extensive experience for education, but not every context, right? And you can imagine kind of generalizing from there.
Quickly, I would add to that list something you mentioned earlier, which is the very advanced state of gentrification in many U.S. cities, so that many people, not just working class people, feel that they are at risk.
I was going to make just the opposite point. If you went to Paris, they would say, "You're 160 years too late with this book." We've been talking about being priced out of neighborhoods since Haussmann, and we have poor people pushed to the periphery in various manners that urbanists have been writing about ever since the mid-19th century. So,
they refuse to use the term
but wouldn't use the term gentrification. But it does raise the question of, did this begin with Ruth Glass, or what do we call the things that were going on that were about power in cities that affected social relations? And gentrification, may be a kinder word for what has happened in many places at many different timescales. And it's great that the other parts of the world will hear this and raise these questions.
And there is advanced gentrification in even places like South Korea. It just has a different name. So it's gentrification without a name. So it's really tricky. But I think there is a really important body of ideas here to think about globally. So we're going to open it up now to the audience for some Q&A. And we have a roving mic here somewhere, Sasha in the back. Should we try the back first? Be easier. Just introduce yourself as well before you ask your question.
Hi, my name is Ruben. I'm an undergraduate here at BU. First, Japonica, thank you so much for coming and presenting today. I've been really excited about getting a copy of this book, and I think this is as good a time as ever to do it. I wanted to sort of ask about your experience looking at gentrification as a term used heavily online. You mentioned that you scraped a lot of news articles and Reddit for the use of gentrification. I feel like a lot of terms that become euphemistic and like semantically bleached in an online context inevitably get like picked up as either like a marketing term or a community identifier in some sort of like post-euphemistic sort of way, like more than euphemistic sort of way. And I think that's especially been a problem with, the overwhelming supremacy of tech companies now. I feel like I've seen gentrification used almost as a term, like online gentrification be used as a term. And then there are tech companies that are now selling the democratization of the internet, which doesn't seem to make very much sense as a concept, but they're selling that as a product. and they're tacking it onto their AI product, or they're tacking it onto their messaging service or party planning, app or something like that. And I was just wondering what you thought about that, if you've seen it be used in that context, or if you think that like the adoption of gentrification as a term on the internet has had some of those like consequences as it's taken up by people who are doing marketing, or taken up by people who are doing business in areas that are wholly non-materialistic, wholly non-urban.
That's a great question. Thank you. I don't have great examples of gentrification being taken up in marketing other than marketing like films or books. But please, if anyone encounters examples, send them to me. One great thing is that as I talk about this, people are sending me new examples that are wonderful. I mean, definitely it's used online all the time, and it's a way to make like a quick critical argument. So, the gentrification of the pride flag, the gentrification of various forms of music, gentrification font, like a specific font that's supposed to look gentrified, for instance, right? And so, yeah, and we've talked about, or I've talked about sort of the promise of all of this talk of gentrification, but there are risks because there's a real watering down, right? Like if it's just something you use quickly to describe a font, it doesn't have quite the political edge that we might hope that it would. So, and all the more so if it's taken up for marketing purposes, right? It may be too, because I said gentrification is generally thought of as a problem, that may keep people from using it overtly as a marketing strategy right now. They certainly used to, but in this moment, they may shy away from it for that reason.
There's one of my favorite terrible examples was the story of Inc. Coffee in Denver in 2017, where the marketing firm that was working with this coffee shop put up a sign outside that said, happily gentrifying the neighborhood since 2011. And the white owner was completely oblivious to how people who remembered the predominantly Black neighborhood would feel that sign. And it was an international background. I read articles in The Guardian, I read it in the New York Times, I read it, lots of places. And the coffee shop had vandalism and graffiti, and the owner apologized. And I don't know, what happened, but I think anybody that's thinking about marketing will wonder about the downside.
Yeah, and I would just say my sense is that this is not like a careful historical study. That's not how I approach this, but I think that's around the tipping point when you can't use gentrification for advertising anymore in a place like Denver, at least, right? And 10 years before, you probably could have gotten away with it, so.
Yes.
I could use my regular voice.
Okay, that's great.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I want to bring up Japonica's first book, A Neighborhood That Never Changes, because for me, that brought out how gentrification is not just an urban term, but was rural and really resort as well. I mean, she spoke about Provincetown. And I'm going to introduce a term I use called speculative gentrification. I've lived for 37 years, part-time and full-time, on the eastern end of Long Island, East Hampton, Long Island. I do a podcast there as well. We're discussing these kind of challenges. And we often quote William Pickens, who lived in the historic Sands section of Sag Harbor, traditional African-American communities. And we quoted him all the time, are we a community or a commodity? And he used that term. I then started reading Robert Putnam, the book Lown, addressing the collapse of community. And how that sort of, for me, led to this speculative gentrification. And if I make it hyper-local into East Hampton, over the past decade, we've started seeing developers forget the south of the highway glamour sections, going into small sections where they were starter homes, rental properties for local communities, and building for the second home market, 5,000 square feet. My own next door neighbor sold to somebody. He was a volunteer firefighter, a teacher. The purchaser just turned it into an Airbnb. I live next to a hotel now. So these are the kind of things. So I guess my question is, how important, I think for me, community is really ground zero in terms of gentrification and the collapse thereof, in addition to just income inequality.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I hope that comes across in the book that that is one of the big anxieties that's driving all this talk of gentrification is fear of the loss of community or using gentrification to look back and reflect nostalgically often on community. I think that is one of the main things people are anxious about and that they use gentrification to evoke. I do think that part of why they turn to gentrification to do this is perhaps because the gentrification scholarship has played a role in maybe making too neat arguments about in point A, pre-gentrification, you have this authentic community, and point B, you have no community at all after the neighborhood is gentrified. And that's overly simplistic, right? There are problems in all communities, and there aren't always tight-knit communities in pre-gentrified places. And so I think I worry that we're replicating some of that oversimplification now by using gentrification as a metaphor that implies the disruption of community. Raymond Williams, a long time ago, suggested that we talk about the countryside as a way to talk about that which is outside of capitalism. And I think community is intertwined with that concept, and that really now we use community to evoke the idea of connections that are outside of capitalism. Now, are there any connections that are really outside of capitalism? I'm not so sure, but I think that's also part of what people are trying to gesture to when they're saying, you know, this community has gentrified. That means this community's been touched by capitalism and it's lost some real kind of authentic connection that people used to have to one another.
And just to add a kind of point to that, so one of the precedent-setting wins that I had when I worked in London against gentrification was actually around the right to community as a kind of precept rather than the right to the city. So I think it's really interesting to think about what right to community means different to right to the city, particularly in legislation and planning legislation. Any other questions, comments? Just introduce yourself as well.
Hey, sure thing. Hi, everybody. I'm Ambria Jones. I'm a first-year doctoral student at Brandeis University. Thank you so much for talking about your book and having this panel. The question that I wrote, because I can be long-winded, so I am from a western suburb of Chicago, so I'm very familiar with current conversations of gentrification in Chicago. And it's not really an inside joke, but when you see a Whole Foods or a Starbucks being open, it's like the first mark of death. And so what I see in my community or in advocacy conversations, that again, we don't feel comfortable using the word gentrification, whereas others feel more comfortable or freely talking about it. So I guess I'm asking, you know, when do you correct the language? What is that like mark of like, I have knowledge of gentrification and we're meeting the criteria of it actually happening? And when do we start using gentrification to acknowledge grief? To say like, we are understanding that this is happening. You go through the stages of grief, you get angry that the community is separating or is changing. You try to barter, you go to community council meetings that you've never been to try to advocate. But then there is a point of acceptance where then there is the removal or the dispersal of communities. So I'm just curious on like, when would you recommend people to start actually using the word, who's more comfortable using the word? And when do we start acknowledging gentrification as community grief? Thank you.
Amazing question. I hope the panelists will jump in. I mean, I think absolutely people are using gentrification to express grief. I, again, think that's one of the dominant ways that it gets evoked. And the things that they're grieving vary depending on how they're using it. Community is one of the main things that they grieve, but it can also be a form of the self before the self changed, right? But I think you're pointing to the political utility of gentrification. And I think right now we live in a moment where we see more and more politicians openly embracing talk of gentrification. We've seen that in some recent mayoral elections in New York, Seattle, Boston. I know Chicago has an anti-gentrification ordinance right now, and I believe it's called an anti-gentrification ordinance, or at least popularly, that's how people are talking about it. And I think that's important. I think it signals that people feel that they can use gentrification in order to spur action. Now, what kind of action they're spurring with the term, I think depends on how it's getting deployed and who's deploying it. As for when you can decide that something is gentrifying, I mean, my goodness, we have debated this round and round and round. I mean, I think work that Loretta and others are doing suggests that the earlier we can signal that gentrification is on its way in, the best prepared we can be to secure a place before it actually happens. So, gentrification tends to be contagious. It tends to move from one neighborhood to another, or even one city to another. So paying attention to what's happening around a given neighborhood, I think, is incredibly important, so you can anticipate that it's coming even before it's an issue. Because gentrification in current form often seems awfully unstoppable without a lot of early intervention.
Thank you so much. I think we're going to have to move on now, but there'll be opportunities later when we mingle for people to have further discussion. So I'm going to maneuver myself up. Thank you so much. Let's give a big round of applause. Okay, you guys going to sit there? You can just sit there, chill. Yeah. Okay, so what I'd like to do now for the next small bit before we all have some kind of nibbles and drinks is to introduce the new Gentrification and Urban Displacement Lab, which has a very strange name, GUDL, which we're still laughing at. So this is one of our newest initiatives at the BU Initiative on Cities. A couple of years ago, we started a pilot scheme, our Urban H, on housing, heat and health. And this is one of the next things we're going to be playing with, I guess is the best kind of description. Now, where did this idea come from? It builds off the back of the International Conference on Gentrification and Displacement that Japonica mentioned, which we ran in 2023. And what we did is we've kind of launched this lab to convene not only researchers, so gentrification scholars, people who from all different disciplines who do work on gentrification, but also policymakers, activists, basically anybody who's working on anti-displacement, anti-gentrification efforts. So our work at GUDL is orientated towards policy and practice. So it's really about knitting not just research with policy and practice, but actually policy itself with practice and practice back to research. So it's kind of filling all those kind of weird loops. So what we're going to be doing is attempting to catalyze new projects, new networks, new connections across different geographies, across different fields. We are hoping to kind of use what we hope and I think will be a really exciting emerging network of people. And we're going to do that to share knowledge, to share best practices, to develop new evidence-based strategies and policies and practices that are going to prevent gentrification-induced displacement. So to give you a sense of how we're kind of doing this, so obviously we're still in the early days of this. We're very much in the early days of building this network. Part of the networking comes off the back of the expertise at BU, but actually also beyond that in Boston and Massachusetts, but also off the back of networks we established off the back of the International Conference on Gentrification and Displacement. But what we've done initially is focus our lens on Massachusetts, on the state of Massachusetts. So we're currently seeking funding to expand our reach beyond Massachusetts, but initially that's where we're going to kind of operate here. So stage one of this pilot has already been a call that we put out a couple of months ago that invited advocates, practitioners and policymakers across Massachusetts to submit requests for collaboration. And this could be absolutely anything. So this was, what do you want? Okay, not what can we tell you? What do you want? And it was anything to do with partnerships, developing new research, exchanges, organizing strategies, policy interventions. So what we ended up with was an absolutely amazing 16 very deep, very thoughtful applications. And these have come from across Massachusetts, so inside Boston, outside Boston, and we're going to share some of their asks with you in a minute, because I think it's a really interesting demonstration of the current landscape in Massachusetts and what people are looking for, what they need, what they want. We're in the very, very kind of, well, we're kind of digging deep now to kind of set up stage 2 of the process, in which any of those applicants who we will have been able to match with a collaborator, as I said, we're a dating agency here, they're going to be eligible to apply for up to $15,000 per project. Okay, so quite important. Notably, not all of the requests that we have gotten require money, thank goodness. We've already begun to form connections and for applicants to exchange kind of networking, exchanging knowledge, exchanging best practices, et cetera, and we're continuing to do that work. And of course, as this lab gets established, we also hope, as the Initiative on Cities, to be offering programming for all members of this network from one another, so seeking each other to learn and teach from each other, but also from outside experts. So what kind of things were people asking for? So across our 16 applications, we did a bit of a scan and looked at some of the themes that have emerged as priorities across Massachusetts. One of them was anti-displacement organising strategies and policy interventions. The other was cultural and political displacement and protecting social networks. We've kind of always known about the cultural. The political is very interesting in the current time, is kind of, you know, coming up that kind of hierarchy. Development without displacement. Displacement indicators, what are they? Risk assessments, what might they look like? Small business anti-displacement strategies. So it's not just about residential displacement, it's also about commercial, retail, small businesses, etc. Gentrification and immigration. Of course, we're a sanctuary city, and, you know, Massachusetts more broadly is very much kind of has a lot of immigration, different people who've actually been displaced from other places. So also getting a sense of those different displacements and how they come together and articulate off the back of, you know, the crisis of affordability in and around Massachusetts. So some of these requests were calls for research partnerships to collect new or analyse existing data. Others were seeking connections with other organisers or models of policy interventions from similar contexts. In addition to the requests that fall under these broad themes, we also received a really interesting request that was focused on faith-based anti-displacement work. There are a lot of churches, there are a lot of faith-based organisations who've been doing amazing work fighting displacement within of communities. We've also been asked for kind of models of policy interventions in other cities, in other contexts, etc. If you want to learn more about how you guys, you in the room here, could plug into this work at GUDL, please feel free to talk to either myself or Stacey Fox, who is here, or Danielle Mulligan, who is here, any of the kind of IOC team. So what we want to do now is really kind of just very quickly share a little bit of the work that we've been doing at the Initiative on Cities. And we're just going to share 3 5-minute snapshots of stuff we've been doing on this recently. And just because I'm up here, not because I'm important, I'm going to talk about my own work in Louisville, Kentucky. So hopefully this will, so we've got 3 presentations here. Firstly by myself, then we're going to hear from Josh, and then Danielle. Okay, so right, good, I'm here. Right, so some of the work that the Initiative on Cities was doing in 2024 is in relation to developing an anti-displacement assessment tool for the city of Louisville in Kentucky. So we thought you might like to hear about this. So not just my work, so a big shout out to the inaugural Initiative on Cities postdoc Kenton Card and to Andre Commandon, who was at USC. We worked as a team, but also Jessica Bellamy, who was head of the Louisville Tenants, and also Ja'Cory Arthur, who was a councilman in Louisville in Kentucky. Without us operating as a team, none of this would have happened. Without Jessica and Ja'Cory organising on the ground, literally this would have not happened at all. And I think that's really important to say straight up. So taking you to Louisville. So just forget Boston for 1 minute. Louisville, Kentucky is the 24th largest city in the United States. It's a mid-sized city that's growing and it's beginning to gentrify. Indeed, mid-sized US cities are probably those that are most at risk of gentrification-induced displacement, and it's where it's probably most acute now. There is now, but there was very little media focus on gentrification in Louisville until after Breonna Taylor's family's lawyer made a connection between the police warrant that led to her death and a gentrification plan in Louisville. So there was also a kind of complex racial politics around what was going on. Then in 2023, they finally woke up and the local newspaper, the Courier-Journal, proclaimed gentrification destroys West End. So this is a very recent case. It's not the more advanced stuff that Japonica's been talking about. So in Louisville, housing need and inequality and the risk of displacement attached to them cannot be isolated from the persistent racial and economic segregation that splits the city on an east-west axis. Black people make up 22% of the Louisville metro population, and West Louisville has historically been the core of the Black community. Redlining schema conformed to the areas that were historically segregated and indeed reinforced the racial splitting of Louisville. The historic marginalization of West Louisville created the conditions, the kind of groundswell for the rapid gentrification that emerged and created really high vulnerability to displacement among residents. So the tenants union, the Louisville Tenants Union, were really concerned that in recent years, developers were using public money. Okay, so public money and resources to build housing that was unaffordable to many Louisville residents, and that this had pushed up rents and increased cost burdens, especially on low-income groups. The fallout was displacement, housing insecurity, but also homelessness. So the legislation that the Louisville Tenant Union pushed, and there was a massive New York Times article about it in 2023, became known as the Anti-Displacement Fair Housing Ordinance. It was presented to Louisville Metro and was passed literally due to their grassroots organising, but also because it was supported by Councilman Ja'Cory Arthur, who at the time was the youngest councilman in Metro Louisville, who worked really hard with them to bolster local support and collate bipartisan support within Metro Louisville. So a really interesting story. The legislation requires all proposed publicly subsidised housing development projects to participate in and pass an assessment of displacement impacts. As part of the anti-displacement ordinance, Metro Louisville had to contract an academic team to develop an anti-displacement assessment tool that they have to use. The Initiative on Cities at BU responded. We were lucky enough to win the bid, and we set out to develop this anti-displacement assessment tool in 2024. So the tool itself was developed explicitly within the context of what was legally required in the Anti-Displacement Ordinance. Now, we did this, and this is where our Gentrification Urban Displacement Lab notion comes in. We did this with Metro Louisville in conversation, with their Office of Housing and Community Development. We did this with the Louisville Tenant Union. We did this with Ja'Cory Arthur, and we heard community groups on the ground at various meetings. So it was a very kind of collaborative endeavour to get this going. And this is exactly the kind of thing that we hope that GUDL is going to do. In November 2024, we were very lucky. The anti-displacement assessment tool, we had to go to Metro Louisville into their city council meetings twice and present it. It got passed, and it's the first of its kind in the United States. So what does it do? Very quickly, it mitigates displacement by evaluating against a set of criteria how well a newly proposed residential project, which is to receive public money, fits within the neighbourhood within which it's proposed, and whether it risks exacerbating the risk of displacement. The tool is online and open access. We've done it so other cities can copy it. The tool dashboard is innovative on two fronts. First, it combines inputs about new projects together with multiple sources of data, from census data to rent hub data, certificate of occupancy, evictions, permits, and other citywide specific data. And what it does is it creates a property-focused assessment of the wider context in which the project is to be developed and how well that project fits the context in terms of affordability. Second, the tool uses these quantitative outputs to assess whether the proposed project is high, medium or low risk of displacement, and then Metro Louisville gets fed that information, and that will give them the powers and actually take the heat, the political heat out of saying yes or no to a developer. And finally, other cities have approached us about this tool, so we're in conversation with some other cities. It was brought internationally to the Greater London Authority by their Housing Committee last year, and it's been mooted as a model for other cities around the globe. But one thing we've become really interested in doing recently is working on it and developing it to look at other kinds of displacement, like commercial displacement, like climate displacement. How does that make the tool? What kind of data is available? How will that be different? And also for looking at non-publicly subsidised development too. So thank you. Now I'm going to welcome up Josh. So Josh is our wonderful Initiative on Cities postdoc who's going to talk about his work.
Hey, thank you. I'm going to try to do the impossible and try to talk in 5 minutes about some of my long-winded work. But this is a sort of a great jump off from what Loretta just talked about in terms of where I'm going to be taking some of the work that I'm going to be doing with a grant that I was able to get from the Institute on Human Geography, which is really looking at green gentrification and how to create a toolkit surrounding the risk of displacement around green gentrification. And I think maybe this is also a great opportunity to add to the complicated structures of what we're talking about, the term of gentrification, and adding a whole new vague sort of term that gets used quite a bit in green gentrification. And just to add a little bit of background for folks who maybe haven't heard this or maybe have sort of vaguely known what this idea is, green gentrification sort of broadly, and there's a lot of other terms that can come from this, environmental, ecological, et cetera. What this really means is that when cities and municipalities create these climate mitigation efforts, looking at sea level rise or urban heat islands or anything that's starting to affect the neighborhood from an environmental and climate justice standpoint, using these mitigation efforts and urban greening processes can sometimes and often do exacerbate or create the conditions for gentrification-related displacement in these already historically oppressed communities is sort of where we come from when we talk about green gentrification. This is my work is also pulling from some work that has been that is finishing up that I've worked with on the what's called the Climate Justice Ready Project, which was an international comparative study on the impacts of green gentrification and risk of displacement, both in Barcelona, Spain, and in Boston. We're through this process. We are finishing up and creating a climate displacement risk index. You can see some of the maps and stuff on the bottom that I'd love to talk to individually at another time. But not only creating a sort of top-down administrative risk index, but also a bottom-up collaborative data analysis through these series of workshops with community organizations and neighbors that we built relationships with to try to critique and make this index better and more available for folks on the ground. What does this really mean to them? This is also pulling from some of my previous work on countermapping what gentrification looks like in East Boston, which is the neighborhood that I live in, which is a sort of largely gentrifying neighborhood in a lot of ways. And through this process of qualitative and participatory mapping, trying to understand how longtime residents experience individual and collective impacts of gentrification using sort of, again, mashing up these administrative top-down and then bottom-up approaches to mapping and understanding these processes using walking interviews, photo mapping, GIS. So what I will be working on with a grant that I had gotten from the Institute on Human Geography is what I'm calling at this point the Urban Environmental Justice Toolkit. UIGT doesn't really work as a moniker, so we'll just say the long term. And again, as I had said, this is sort of building off these sort of different work that I had been doing previously, the Climate Justice Ready projects, the counter mapping, participatory photo mapping that I've done previously and continuing to do. And also, again, as Loretta sort of teed off, what Louisville and what hopefully other places are doing with the anti-displacement assessment tool. What this will do with working with organizers that I have on the ground, we'll co-create a tool that assesses the impact of new and proposed infrastructure projects on environmental and displacement risks. So really putting together the environmental justice aspect into this and what are the consequences going to be, co-created alongside organizers and activists that I have a relationship with and organize with in East Boston, Chelsea, and Everett, which are their own sort of interesting communities that I'd love to talk more about later on. Explicitly to be able to be used by organizers, activists, and policymakers using these community-based, participatory, and geospatial methodologies. And this is generally what the whole process will, in theory, look like, starting with data collection, both using administrative data, looking at displacement risk and environmental justice indicators, as well as this community-based approach using participatory photo mapping for this bottom-up approach, where we'll combine all that information and to create a sort of early on toolkit. And we'll bring that toolkit to workshops in the community to rework, to make better, and to train on, and then eventually into the hands of organizers in a way that they can sort of push for policies and push for endeavors that will keep, hopefully, displacement from happening and create a better environment without the displacement as well. Thanks.
And now we have Danielle Mulligan, who is the Associate Director at the Initiative on Cities and is also wonderful.
I'm going to try to time myself here. Hi, everyone. My name is Danielle Mulligan. I am excited to be here with you all talking a little bit about some research I've been working on the remaking of a hidden gem, gentrification in schools in East Boston. Just want to give a quick shout out to my co-researchers. Natalie, who's with us here today, is a PhD student in sociology, and then Kimberly Landaverde-Guillen recently graduated from BU, and she was also supported by the CIS mini grant, so I want to thank them for that support. She's also a lifelong resident of East Boston. So today I'm going to be talking about a specific case, but I want to situate that in a broader conversation about gentrification and schools. We really intuitively connect housing and schools. And so we often talk about, folks choosing different housing where they live based on schools, or we think about the connection between white flight and the change in urban flatwork and school desegregation. But we are rarely often, or I've often seen gaps in both research and policy, bridging the connections between the return of wealthier, whiter, highly educated residents into cities and schools, both the ways that schools are active in that process and how they're also impacted by that process. And so these are some questions that broadly guide this research and hopefully some additional work in this area. So the case that we are working on is located in East Boston. And so Josh mentioned this, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with the neighborhood of East Boston. The neighborhood is historically a immigrant and working class neighborhood. There's been many waves of immigration over time in the most recent decades, but mostly from South and Central America. It's also a rapidly gentrifying neighborhood, and you can look at the different demographics to see those changes. You can look at the rent and housing prices, but you can also see it really visibly. And it's really visceral when you walk through the neighborhood. If you walk from Maverick Square to the waterfront, you can see it quite starkly. The school that we're looking at is located in East Boston. It was one of the schools that in 2011, there were Boston Public Schools closed 13 schools across the city. This school was a small elementary school. It was deemed or called a hidden gem by many of the folks that we spoke to, both who've been involved in the school historically and presently. And the school was actually merged with a much lower performing middle school. This is an important detail because the elementary school was actually increasing its academic achievement and also in its enrollment. So it's not typically a school that's set for closure. When the school was merged with this lower performing middle school, many of the community members didn't actually move over to the middle school because of this reputation that the school had. And so a lot of the community was pretty scattered across East Boston and other schools. In 2014, the building that had sat vacant since 2011 was reopened. It was actually reopened as the first public Montessori school in Boston Public Schools. And it was opened mostly in response to the advocacy of a majority white middle-class population that had attended a pilot classroom of a Montessori school nearby and had advocated to the district to reopen this building. That came with a lot of funds to renovate the building, and the building had been in decline and really update the space for this school. You can also see some racial trends here. You see that the increasing Hispanic population before the closure, declining white population, and you can see how those trends have reversed since reopening. So to learn more about this case, we conducted 38 interviews with former and current educators, parents, as well as former students. We also went out and engaged in community events and spoke with current and former educational and policy leaders. So there's a few different themes that have come up from our work, and we are still in the process of data analysis. But I think one thing that I really wanted to highlight from our research thus far is the mirroring of what we see in neighborhoods happening in this school and the ways that the school sort of represents and is demonstrating some of these neighborhood changes. And so this is a quote from an educator who was displaced to a different school during the closure. And you see in this quote that she's talking about the sort of disenfranchisement and frustration of being both pushed out of the school, but then seeing this new school in its place with no sort of communication or engagement with the former population. And so in certain ways, I think that this demonstrates and echoes some of the changes happening in the neighborhood. So first we see displacement in the neighborhood. And so when the schools close, there's displacement of families, of educators to other schools and other places. We also see this financial investment in infrastructure. And so in the neighborhood, you see a lot of this physical changes happening. And in the school, you also see a very significant financial investment in the school, not only to fix the building, but to transition these classrooms into Montessori classroom, it requires a certain specific investment. And then lastly, it's the shifting in social and political capital in the school and in the community. And so we heard from different people in the school, both about the ways that that capital was used and leveraged to open the school and to advocate to the school district, as well as the capital and political power that these parents and majority white parents retain in the school to kind of shift and shape how the school is run. And so we see this kind of shifting of capital within the school as well. And then lastly, we just wanted to touch on this question of the role of schools in neighborhood change. Are they active in this process? And so this is a quote from a white parent that we interviewed. And I think it's really interesting. She's sort of reflecting as we're interviewing her about the relationship between the neighborhood and the school. And this is also reflective of another interview we had where we had a white family tell us that the opening of the school was actually what anchored them to the community when their kids turned school age. And so it was that school and the option to have their kids all go to that school that kept them in place. And so we're hoping to explore this a little bit more as we go through our data analysis. I love talking about this topic, so if anyone wants to chat more, I'd love to talk at the reception or follow up after.
Okay, you're probably getting tired, but just 2 more slides. What we want to do is talk a little bit about some forthcoming events and publications from the Initiative on Cities, because of course you're all invited. So one thing we're working on at the moment is we're sponsoring a photography exhibition, Right to the City, from mid-June to mid-August. And we're going to be welcoming the IOC External Advisory Board member, community activist and photographic ethnographer, Dominic Malden, who's done the most amazing kind of housing activist work across the United States, to Boston University to show his photographs, both in the US, but actually also internationally. He's been taking them in lots of different locations. And we are going to be running that in the Boston University Stone Gallery on Comm Ave. The exhibit, I think it runs through to August the 8th. I think it is, yeah. It runs through till about August the 8th. What's really cool about this one is we're also going to do the same exhibition in London in the fall. So it's going to be a twinned international exhibition between Boston and London. And we're working with partners in London on this as well. The other thing we've been working on that's about to come out is a small business area, a kind of SBAN, which is the kind of anti-displacement network for small businesses run out of the University of Maryland. I've been on the board for some years now. We've worked together collectively on a small business anti-displacement network guidebook. And this is a new data guidebook for small businesses and their advocates who are facing gentrification-induced displacement in the US. As you can imagine, small business data is often missing, it's often misleading. Too often the data we rely on undercounts the very businesses most vulnerable to displacement. This gap, of course, reflects structural inequities, not business realities. So what the guidebook does, and it's coming out quite soon, is it starts from the idea that data is never neutral. It shows how equity-centered data practices can reduce harm, build trust and support anti-displacement work, even if you're using imperfect data. Data's never perfect. And last but not least, Japonica and myself and some others are editing a book called Fighting to Stay Put, Learning from the Global Struggle Against Gentrification and Displacement. This is going to be published open access with UCL Press, came out of the Gentrification Conference. The book's due on the 1st of March. Just putting Japonica in the hot seat there. This book shares knowledge, strategies, tactics, and practices from activists, scholar activists, and local communities fighting gentrification and displacement on the ground from around the world. So for the first time, coming together and learning. It reveals what's worked, what's not worked in specific fights against gentrification. It also elucidates the emergence of new thinking and strategies, as well as new directions we might take in the future. And in fact, we're honoured to have, and I'm going to point her out here, do you want to stand up? We're honoured to have one of the most amazing activists featured in the book here today, Akanksha Badka. She has a background. This woman is amazing. She has a background in constitutional and public law and human rights. She has represented Dalit communities before the Delhi High Court and the Supreme Court of India in cases where they're being evicted from slums, part of this kind of process of slum gentrification that I've talked about before. We're very lucky she's in the United States. She's doing some work in Berkeley at the moment, so she flew across to be with us. She is awesome, so please try and talk to her and learn more about her work when we mingle in a minute. So just quickly, not only a big thank you to the audience, but I want to say a special big thank you to Japonica for presenting her wonderful book to us, to our 3 panelists from across the river who are awesome. And I'd also like to say a big thank you to the IOC team, Ting, our comms manager at the back, Stacey and Danielle, and everybody in the room. So thank you.